Welcome to 5 Dubs by MDDC Press. I'm your host, Rebecca Snyder, the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, and DC Press Association, which represents news media in our region. 5 Dubs focuses on the who, what, when, where, and why of local news media. We'll talk with the journalists about the stories behind the news. You can find more information about our guests in the show notes or on our website, www.5-dubs.com. Welcome, everyone. I am so excited to have Jane Elizabeth with us today to talk about fake news. That's a term that's been bandied about, and Jane has spent a lot of time in a lot of diverse places talking about the crisis of misinformation, how to spot fake news, pink slime journalism, all these buzzwords that we're going to unpack and understand so that people can become a little bit more aware of these different types of information. So welcome to the program, Jane.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
So tell us a little bit, just looking at your LinkedIn, you have done, you've been an educator for a long time. You also have worked as an editor, as a consultant. So tell me a little bit about your journey and why this topic of misinformation is so critical to you.
Well, first of all, I've taught at 5 different universities, but never full time. So I've always been an adjunct. So, going to my newspaper job and then running over to the other side of town to teach journalism. At
So you're
5
a
different
juggler too. Okay, good.
We all are. I started at a newspaper in Richmond, and then I moved to Pittsburgh to the Post-Gazette, and I went to the Virginian Pilot as their first digital news editor. And then the Washington Post hired me to launch Post Local, which is the section of the website that covers Virginia, Maryland, and DC local news. So that was in 2010, and we're a little bit late to the game at the Post there, but that was our catch up. And then I left the Post in 2014 to go work for the American Press Institute. And if you remember, 2014 was quite a year when the election was ramping up for the 2016 election. And I was hired to look at fake news and misinformation and the problem of misinformation and try to figure out how we could best train newsrooms, because that's what API does, is train newsrooms and, hire researchers and find out the best research and the best training programs, how we could prepare newsrooms for fake news. And little did we know that it would be like it is today. We thought we were going to solve the problem. So in 2014, what I first did was talk to a bunch of wonderful researchers. All this research in journalism is going on behind the scenes, and it's really a shame that more journalists don't know about it. I was just so impressed at the topics, everything, and just a wide range of topics in journalism that researchers and academics all over the country are doing. And as a journalist, as a longtime journalist, I had no idea. Their research is a whole nother conversation, but their research doesn't trickle down to the working journalist, unfortunately. So that was an eye opener for me. They were already ahead of the game on misinformation and disinformation. And so, we did a lot of studying and testing and came up with a training program that we were rolling out, knowing that we would have to adapt it here and there. And I think that, we originally thought that we give people the facts. We show journalists how to present facts in a very visible way, and we've solved their problem of fake news.
Well, and that is, I think there's a real sort of the MO in the journalist world is like, well, if we just tell people the facts, if we just lay it out there, people will understand and they will make decisions. But it strikes me, I was listening to Bill Adair, the founder of PolitiFact, talk about fact checking and how delicate that is in some way, because nobody likes to be told you're wrong. And so that idea of misinformation and fact checking kind of gets into our belief systems as well, because we're trying to make sense of the world. Um, but we can unpack that a little bit more in just a minute, because I wanted to kind of hear. Sounds like you've been dealing more with misinformation for a long time. And what did you find out in the research that you saw?
I found out a lot of things. It was a real education for me. And I wish every journalist could go through something like that. Um, but I discovered that it's obviously not that simple. We think we have facts, we can proceed with our lives, but that is not how other people look at it. And I think we are guilty of internalizing our own processes on
Hmm.
how we determine, um, how to make decisions in our lives. And not everybody does that. So I think the biggest thing I learned is a lot about psychology. And
Mm,
I was thinking at the time, when I was in grad school, um, I s- had a specialty in criminology. And now I wish it had been psychology. So I would recommend that then. I mean, it's a good skill to have, just interviewing people who might be difficult or, that you don't know where they're coming from. But there are a lot of reasons that people don't believe facts. And it's not because they don't have the facts. The facts are there, but they
hmm.
still don't believe it. So we sort of pivoted to looking at all those reasons that people spread misinformation, that they believe misinformation, and tried to bring in awareness to journalism about that. Because if you know about that, you're probably going to do your job a little bit differently. You're
Sure, like
probably
maybe present things
Mhm.
a little bit
Yeah,
differently. And
right.
so, can you talk a little bit about why people do spread misinformation? What is the psychology behind people's adherence to like very clear situation, like alternative facts, and why people go after things that are like obviously proven false, but they still persist in those beliefs?
Right. Well, I think there's a difference between believing it and spreading it. A lot of people believe things that they don't talk about. But, several years later, everybody has a platform, and
Hmm.
there is more spreading of misinformation on Nextdoor. I mean, Nextdoor didn't exist when we were working on this at API, and Facebook definitely has ramped up, and Twitter became something totally different. But yeah, so the belief part of it. I mean, one thing that you already mentioned is people don't want to be wrong. They do not want to be wrong.
It's not
So
my favorite thing for sure.
no, and but some people will really dig into it. I remember, this is a little bit of a tangent, but bear with me because there's a point here. When I was in Pittsburgh, I had done a series of stories on teachers who were pedophiles who were abusing their students, and it was almost without exception. Every one of the teachers and the parents um, that I talked to, the parents did not want to believe that the teacher was a predator, because if you've studied or read about pedophiles at all, they're usually very charismatic and friendly,
Mhm.
and that's how they're able to establish a relationship with the child. And so they're charismatic. The parents love them, the kids love them,
Mhm.
and you will show the parents proof, um, police reports and statements by other children and statements by teachers, and they say it's a lie. They don't want to believe it because they feel so guilty and so wrong about really putting their child in a situation that that was so dangerous, that this is their most important job, to protect their child, and they didn't do it.
Mhm.
And people will dig in. You would tell them anything and they say, you're a liar. that he didn't do this. This didn't happen. So anyway,
Is that and I just wanna make sure I understand because in, like, the way you've described that, it feels like sometimes people persist in misinformation to, like, keep their own self-concept intact. So,
yes,
even though, as a parent, mm, I need to protect my child, and if you're not protecting your child if you're not believing that they're in this situation and
that's
whatnot.
right.
So it's almost like that parent is saying, my subconsciously, I doubt anyone's like articulating this, but like my self concept and the way I view the world and my concept of me protecting my child is so important that I'm actually going to disadvantage or harm my child to keep my own self belief. Is that
Right.
is that right?
To yes, that's part of it. The other part is that they have made a decision, and this brings it back to politics. I mean, another very important decision is who you vote for president,
Hmm.
and they vote for someone, and then doesn't turn out so well, but they still persist in believing that they don't want to be wrong. They made the right choice, and they will just dig in. And this is where you know they seek out this is the other psychology part of it. They seek out information that fits with their worldview, and
Hmm.
that's called confirmation bias. We've heard a little bit about that. um, Motivated reasoning is another one that we study, and it's collecting information that you want to be true, not because it is true, but you want it to be true. So
Hmm.
therefore, it is true. And then you have just family traditions. You know, my grandparents were Republicans. My great grandparents were Democrats. It is a family tradition. That's very strong pull for people. They're
Hmm.
not going to go against what their or generations of their family has believed or the party they voted for. And I know we've all heard that before. Um, but I think a lot of this that needs a lot of our attention as journalists is fear and anger. I mean,
Hmm.
fear drives so many decisions and anger to a lesser extent. And people are afraid of things that they don't know about, that they don't understand, um, like transgender kids in bathrooms.
Hmm.
All of the things you can, and DEI, all of that. You can see where people are frightened by it because they don't understand the concept, they don't understand the ramifications. And I don't think that we can overestimate the fear and anger over those things. I have another example of a neighbor of mine whose mother was diagnosed with dementia, and it was very sad. She was very sick. But my neighbor decided that it was the COVID vaccine that caused it. And yeah, because you feel helpless, you feel angry, you want to blame somebody or something. So she decided that was it. And, she talked about that a lot, and she convinced some of her friends and family not to get the vaccine and still at it. So
Wow. And that has real repercussions. I mean, COVID's here forever and
exactly.
still need your vaccines. So, um, I was gonna ask a little bit more about misinformation and is it kind of pulled into politics, but then your COVID example and the COVID vaccine has been politicized, it feels. But do you feel
Yes.
like misinformation kind of starts in the political realm or is it everywhere? Is it like cropping up just sort of,
Yeah.
spontaneously?
Well, when I say misinformation, I think a lot of people just use that as a catch-all. It's
Mhm.
just something that's not true. Um, but as far as research goes, there are different types of misinformation. There's misinformation, there's disinformation, and there's malinformation.
Ooh,
So
let's unpack those differences.
well, misinformation is anything that it's what it sounds like. It's wrong. But in the past, and generally, misinformation is defined as something that may have been an honest mistake. It may include those honest mistakes or beliefs that people honestly had and didn't know was wrong. But disinformation is a campaign. It's a campaign to
Mhm.
get people to believe one issue or another, um, by purposely providing um, fake, false news, false information. So that's what disinformation is, and that's what you see. It's connected to politics more than
Mhm.
anything else. Um, Malinformation is, I think, the up and coming misinformation because that includes deep fakes, um, you know, manipulating videos and people's words to promote a cause, and
Mhm.
it's a cause that usually has a bad outcome, which is why it's called malinformation. So we have all those types of misinformation, and fake news is, I guess, maybe a catch-all too, but
Mhm.
that's stuff that people just totally made out of nothing.
Well, and so I found it really interesting that you decide when you did your checklist, and I don't want to make, it seem like, oh, here was this like really highly polished, articulated checklist of how to spot fake news, but it was a Facebook post. And so I think as a lifelong journalist, it was interesting to me that you also write on Medium. You have different channels is sort of where I'm getting. And one of the avenues that you decided to use was Facebook. Was that because you're sort of going to the source and sort of more egalitarian, sort of democratic with a little d, kind of spreading of information, or is that where you saw the problems most? Tell me a little bit about that choice, and then I
Yeah.
want to go into that checklist too.
I went to Facebook because that's where the people are. I think a lot of journalists now sort of see themselves, I hope they do see themselves as ambassadors for
Hmm.
journalism and explaining who we are and how we work. And actually started doing that very intentionally during COVID because we all started working at home. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I was never home before. I didn't know my neighbors. I didn't know anybody. And all of a sudden I'm, there in the neighborhood and involved in doing my own grocery shopping and things like that. And having conversations with people and beginning to understand how little people know about journalism. And, with, my background in misinformation, sort of seeing how that happens in real life. So I made a point of, responding to things on social media where people in the neighborhood or wherever would say things that were totally not true about journalism or about a topic or about the president or the election. And I would try to respond in a very nice way and explain, how journalism works, or here's something you should read. If they post something that's totally false, I would just say, I'd find a really good story and link to it. And
You were like a
sometimes,
freelance fact checker in some ways.
yeah, I was a distributor of facts and always tried to make sure that there was no paywall and something that
Hmm.
people could, because otherwise people were not reading. People have just fallen away from reading good professional journalism. And I think it helped. I mean, people hated me, but they also thanked me. So I just kept doing it. But that's when I lived in North Carolina. I forgot to say I was managing editor of the Raleigh News and Observer after I left API, and I
Hmm.
lived in North Carolina. Next door was the platform. Next door was the big thing there. It wasn't Facebook.
Okay.
It was next door. So you kind of have to choose find out what your neighbors are looking at, where they're getting their information, and then kind of go from there. So where I am now, which is in Hampton, Virginia, um, it's Facebook.
Hmm.
And we actually have, I think, three neighborhood pages on
Oh
Facebook.
wow. That's
And
robust.
so, yeah, it really is. Um,
Now, do you think that you have those pages because local news has shrunk? And I don't know the news media landscape in the Hampton area, but that's kind of rural Southwest Virginia, if I'm getting my
it's
geography
it's
correct.
on the Chesapeake Bay.
Oh, okay. So I'm totally
For
wrong.
sure.
So Southeast
But
Virginia.
you're
Okay.
not wrong about, the media landscape has shrunk, and people do complain about that. They're not getting the micro local news that they used to get with sports coverage and, you know, printing events calendars and the local honor roll and things like that. People still complain about all of that stuff. So I think you're right. I mean, I never heard anybody really say that, but I think there's still this need for information about your neighbors and a desire to have that. So,
And then I
yeah,
guess sort of in the abyss, if you have all these sort of sometimes let's hope well-meaning, well-intentioned people saying, "Oh, here we're going to crowdsource this information," but maybe not having the media literacy or that we had of old. And I think it's quantifiable that civics literacy has gone down in the U.S. because it's not being taught as deeply in schools and it's not as prioritized. People fall prey to being taken advantage of in some ways.
right.
Because I think we've all, had a situation where it sounds plausible. Like, okay, I get that. You're passing it along. And then you realize, oh, wait, had I done just a little bit of thinking or searching, I could have figured this out. So what are your tips for spotting fake news?
Well, the checklist you talked about was one day I got a fake newspaper in my mailbox, and that is what is known as a pink slime publication. It's also digital. In fact, I think most of the pink slime sites, it's mostly digital. I was kind of surprised to get an actual printed newspaper in
Sure.
my mailbox, but um, that when I got one, I knew all my neighbors got it too, right? So,
Hmm.
and I had actually not seen one in print before. So I'm looking at it and I'm going through it and knowing immediately what all the signs are, what all the red flags are, and knew immediately that what it was. But I knew my neighbors wouldn't. I mean, we think that people have these critical thinking skills or use them in that way, and they don't. And no reason they should. They're not trained in it, but who's going to tell them? So this is the kind of thing I like to do. So I just
Hmm.
posted on Facebook. Y'all probably got this pink slime newspaper, and I had to explain pink slime, and then tried to think about how I very quickly determined that it was not real, but parse that out and, create the tips. So, um, the first thing was I had never heard of it before, and I know the media landscape in my region, and so that was the first tip. Um, there were no reporters' names on any stories.
Hmm.
And regular people don't really look at reporters' names on newspaper articles. They just don't. I learned that a long time ago. So they're not going to look at that. There was no contact information, no mailing address, um, no send letters to the editor to whatever, no phone,
Hmm.
nothing, absolutely nothing. Um, the content itself, I mean, it looked like a regular newspaper. It wasn't that bad. It was a little amateurish, but it wasn't that bad. But every single story had a bias in the headline. And then you read the story and it was definitely biased but still kind of using all the journalistic lingo that you would see in another
Hmm.
story. But then you notice there's no one from the other side quoted in here. There's no academic talking about this issue. There's no expert. It's just all politicians from one particular party. And
Mm.
again, I don't know. Do people really notice that kind of thing? I mean, I just don't know that that's going to click for them. So, uh, and I hope I'm wrong about that, but I think I'm right. So,
Well, and I
um,
do feel like people don't, journalists do not talk enough about their craft and sort of what those standards of professional journalism are. And so, to a working journalist or someone who has that experience, you want an expert, you want a stakeholder, you want, a witness kind of thing. There are certain roles or certain sources that you need to fully report a story. And, you should have at least two sources. You should have all these pieces.
Right.
And like it gives a fuller picture to just, a general passerby if they're reading the article. But I don't think that they're thinking, oh, yes, there's the expert
Yes.
saying this. Here's
Right.
the person who made it happen kind of thing.
Well,
So I agree.
the other thing about this pink slime, the sites and the printed product is that they do put in real information from the community, but it's all information that is readily available online. So they're just pulling off the local bus schedule and they'll put that on there. So
Mm.
surround it or the school menu or the honor roll or whatever they can pull off the site that is a government site that they won't get in trouble for copyrights and things like that. So it does give an air of, oh, this is my local newspaper, even though
It
I
feels
never heard of
homey.
it before.
Yeah.
It feels homey. And even though the information is not that useful and pretty old, there is local information in there. So it's
Do you feel
very
like there's
handy.
photography in there, or is it more like stock photos or headshots? Like, do,
It's
when you're
no,
just sort of out in the world?
there's very little actual photography in there. The photos are all from campaigns. They're
Hmm.
campaign handout photos. So that's another issue to look for. But again, I don't know how many people really look that closely at it. And I had people who said, "Gosh, I'm glad you posted that because I didn't know what this thing was."
Hmm.
And um, but I'm sure were many people who believed everything they read. So, and
So,
there are actually two of those delivered to our mailboxes in the run up to the election.
oh wow! And
Yeah.
so, are you? And let's talk a little bit about pink slime journalism in general. It's such an evocative name, and I believe that pink slime journalism kind of goes to the 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 it relates to chicken nuggets and the
And
filling.
hamburgers. Yes. Yes.
Yes. I
Exactly.
was like, how do I say that? But yeah, so like the extruded chicken product that goes into fast food chicken nuggets. And so talk a little bit about pink slime and why it works for people who are trying to spread disinformation.
Well, I think it's a very calculated, first of all, it's very calculated on the part of whoever is publishing it because they're looking at the demographics of the neighborhood and they're like, okay, these people have kids in school. They're not subscribing to newspapers. Um, they probably grew up with newspapers and remember it from their household, so they might be impressed by this. And then they have the websites too that are sort of aimed at a different audience. But there are about 1,000 of these sites plus newspapers in the country right now.
Hmm.
And there's an organization called NewsGuard that tracks it. So anybody can go on their website and find all of the latest, I hope the latest titles for the websites and the newspapers. Um, you can also, I would recommend to journalists who are interested, sign up for their newsletter. They do have a free newsletter product. They have some paid versions too, but um, anything to make that top of mind, I think that would be helpful for journalists too. But
And just as a little aside for people who are listening, it's NewsGuard, NEWSGUARD Tech TECH.com
okay,
is the
and
website. Yeah.
okay, um, so you know this started in, I believe, in the 2016 elections, but it just grew and grew and grew. And people ask, why is this legal? How is this legal? But it is because we have this thing called the First Amendment. It's legal. You know,
Hmm.
they, it's perfectly proper. So, but you also need to know that these sites get their money from political PACs, super PACs, and yeah, because that's another thing. You wonder how they're making any money off of this because there's no ads in there, and
Right. So,
it's a
yeah, the
free
purpose, it's not
product.
necessarily clicks, it's changing minds.
Right, right. It's just changing minds or it's just seeding your mind with some information that is incorrect or incomplete, and um, you know, especially in a very contested election. And a lot of us had that during the past election. So
And
I assume they are very effective because if they weren't, we wouldn't have seen them in 2020 again. We wouldn't be seeing them now.
right. Now, do you feel like it's becoming more and more prevalent? Because you have a sort of a wide range. You've been working on these issues, you know, since the early 2000s. Do you feel like it's becoming? I mean, in some ways, it feels like maybe this type of disinformation is almost in some areas outweighing traditional news or true journalistic resources. Do you feel like you're kind of awash in a sea of disinformation?
I don't think I am, but I think a lot of people are. I think that's absolutely true. As I said, most people in my neighborhood do not have newspaper delivery. And because the news organizations, unfortunately, in our region have shrunk so much, um, they don't feel that they're getting, any bang for their buck when they pay for a
Hmm.
subscription. So they've dropped their subscriptions. And I know this because I've talked to so many people about
Hmm.
it. And so I think they are getting their information from Facebook, from their neighbors, also from some of the crime apps that, again, a whole nother story. The
Hmm.
local neighborhood crime apps that um, are very sketchy and also mostly incorrect. And I see those posts all the time that this happened. This guy robbed the ABC store when it was just some kid shoplifting. you know, they're extrapolating from the very very sparse information they see on these apps and just kind of making up stories to go with it. That just happens constantly. So I absolutely think that mainstream journalism, traditional journalism, is not where they're getting their information anymore. That is very far down on the list.
So it feels like this tsunami of disinformation, and you have journalists who are sort of plugging away, doing the best they can within the world that they're living in now. How do you? What would you suggest? How do you, aside in some ways, doing what you're doing, which is educating the people in your periphery? I think this gets back into some of those belief systems, and disinformation has kind of a drumbeat of small bits of disinformation kind of consistently being shared to just kind of infiltrate your belief system and how you operate in the world. What do you think journalists can do?
Well, I think the journalism organizations should lead the charge on this. I mean, individual journalists can certainly do their part, but um, we have a public radio station, WHRO here, um, who fantastically hired a news team. We had no
Mm,
radio news here before. They got a big grant. They have, I think, a dozen reporters now, some of whom they hired from the local newspaper after they got laid off. And
mhm.
they went out on a road show. They spent a whole year. Oh, hi, Kitty.
Yes,
they
there's
spent a
always a
whole
cat.
they
Glories of
spent a
working from home.
right. They spent a whole year um, going all over the region, and they would have several people from the news team and the news director and other people affiliated with the station go to. They seem to like brew pubs a lot, so they would go and
Mhm.
um, people would get beer and they'd sit around and take questions and they talk about their new news team. And I went to a couple of them because they were sort of in my neighborhood, They were very well attended. So they did a great job doing that, and they were able to introduce this space behind the voice and
Mhm.
behind. They also started a daily newsletter for people who don't listen to the radio, and I thought that was a great idea. Just introducing yourselves and making people understand that there are real people with real jobs and ethics. When
Mhm.
people ask me um, the difference between um, a news organization that a traditional news organization and some of the ones that we're seeing um, out there today, I say if you can tell a real professional news organization if the people who work there, if they do something wrong and they get fired, then those are professionals. Can you get fired for this? Yes. Okay. People want to hear that. They want to know if you do something wrong that there are
There's
repercussions.
repercussions. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And you have ethics policies. But I think
Mhm.
that's one thing. I know it's a big ask for journalists who just don't have time to do anything with smaller staffs and things like that. But um, I just think it's well worth finding a way to introduce yourself to the community
Mhm.
and do that on a regular basis. Um, but also just knowing, and I guess I'm talking about local journalists now, just knowing
Mhm.
um, that you have knowledge that other people don't have when you're a local journalist. Like you should you should be able to tell if somebody is telling you something about a local news story, it's not true. I mean, you're going to know right away it's not true. And not only that, you know who to go ask to find out.
Mhm.
The authoritative sources to ask if this is true or false. I mean, I think local journalists are just so well positioned to help fight misinformation and disinformation. But I think you have to be intentional about it. You have to think this is what I'm doing and this is how I'm going to do it.
Mhm.
uh, there are just so many different things that a local news organization can do to point out fake news and to help people understand it. The one I don't remember who did this, but there's one newsroom when they have a video, um, man on the street interviews, whatever, and the people in the video are saying things that are completely wrong, and they're um, it's definitely misinformation. They put a warning label on the video.
Oh,
Just
interest.
yeah, just like you would do if there was, unsettling content or, adult content or mentions of suicide or whatever. We do that on a regular basis, but to warn people that there are misstatements of fact in this video because it's
Mhm.
video, and you let people talk and you can't really
Right.
correct them a lot in real time. So, just being creative like that, I just think there are so many things that we can do that we're not really thinking of right away.
Well, and it might also be, I think printing if you're not reaching the audience that's really being targeted by misinformation, printing, the explainer of like how to spot fake news in your publication maybe is not going to reach the right target. But I do feel like news has, and I think this is a sea change or something that news organizations don't necessarily think about, but using their social channels as education, as civics education vehicles.
Mhm.
You can then put your explainer about what fake news is, or calling it out as you see it. And I'm interested in your take on the reticence of you sort of journalism writ large to talk about. I mean, I think there was a lot of discussion in previous election cycles about like, well, we don't need to call out, object lies because people will figure that out. Like, we're just not going to um, sort of react to. We're just going to stay the course and talk about what's true and objective and verifiable, and let everything else pass by. It sounds like you're proposing that journalists take a stronger view and maybe even call out that misinformation when it occurs.
right. And I think after probably around the 2020 election, journalists started backing off of what you just said about, we don't, we're not going to repeat this misinformation. We're just going to state the facts. It wasn't working. And I think if you think about it, critically, that it's not going to work. But, the vehicle is very important. Like you said, the social media that your community is using, that is really the best vehicle to use those explainers, to publish those explainers. You're right. They're not going to see it if they're not subscribing to your newspaper, or they've never had the habit of listening to the radio news. They're not going to they're not going to access those explainers in any other way. But because you're a local news reporter, you know what your community is into. You know if they're on Nextdoor or, um, X or Instagram, whatever it is, you can find that out pretty easily, whether it's a particular Facebook page, and infiltrate that. I mean, you have a
Mhm.
right to be there with everyone else. And, I would recommend, especially on Nextdoor, which is such a cesspool. Don't get me started on Nextdoor.
Mhm.
um, to kind of join and look around and see who's talking about what, and who the very loud, noisy people are, and then see if you can insert yourself in to be sort of a voice of reason without looking arrogant. It's tricky, People, as soon as they know you're a journalist, they're probably going to attack you anyway. So, and it's extra work. These are all reasons why journalists don't want to do these things. But
Mhm.
I just think if you think about it as another platform, another way to get your message out that is really effective, then I think that you'll be more into doing it. It's just a shame that there aren't more journalists who post their stories and get into discussions with people. The
Mhm.
other thing journalists can do, just on any story, um, when you are interviewing people who have misinformed ideas about a topic or an issue that's going on in your community, but very strong opinions about it, like COVID vaccines or whatever, to really kind of change the way you interview people and find out why. Why do you
Mhm.
believe this? There's always a reason. And I would love to see some training on that and some role playing in newsrooms. Um, like, how do you get somebody to talk about their deeply held beliefs, but why they believe them? You
Mhm.
know, what happened? Maybe they don't even know, but get them to really think about this. And like, what was your first experience in hearing about a COVID vaccine? And um, what were the conversations you had? And is there somebody in your family who received a vaccine of any sort and got sick? I mean, just and do it not in a critical way, but just, I'm just really curious about your belief, your strongly held belief. And I don't hear a lot of that. I don't see a lot of that in news stories. And then when you write your story, then you can say, Mrs. Jones believes this because her
Mhm.
parents did, and her grandparents, or whatever it is. You can explain that and help all the rest of us understand why people believe the things they do. And once you understand that, I think then you can think of ways to make the truth and make the facts more presentable to
Mhm.
them.
Well, and I think also there's two things that strike me there. One, the news cycle is so quick and so relentless that a lot of times reporting becomes very transactional. And the types of questions that you're proposing are that let's take a step back and let's really get to understand and know the source, which leads to much stronger stories and better reporting. But there's that drumbeat of like, okay,
Right.
I gotta write this up, file it, and move on. So I think there's that piece, and then also, I think that the story becomes it's hard to set aside one's own judgment, and one's own bias, no matter where you are, and
Mhm.
I I do feel like there's sort of a almost a knee-jerk reaction for journalists to say sometimes, to say that, "Oh my goodness, this person's just off the deep end." Like, "What? You don't you don't," and so that kind of discounts, what that person is trying to bring up, and it kind of feeds that cycle in some ways because then that's alienating, like, "Oh, well, I can news media doesn't represent me." And
Right.
so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about sort of how to overcome those pieces because it makes it more divisive, um, and more polarizing in some ways.
Your own biases are going to play into this so much. And I mean, recognizing our biases, obviously, that's a very important thing to do. Um, and like you said, I think our first reaction in talking to someone who believes that Hillary Clinton has, a pedophile ring in the basement of a pizza parlor, you're just like, oh
That's
my
so
God.
ludicrous, like, how can and
I
then
know
I'm
we're
like, "Well,
like,
where do we go?"
what? It's really, I mean, it's really even hard to keep a straight face. Maybe we're used to it now, but we're mostly like, what is this person? I'm going on to the next person. But there are just too many people who believe crazy things right now. So one thing, if anybody is an adjunct professor in journalism, one thing that I love to do in my classes um, is to tell tell the students we're going to have a debate
Mhm,
and ask someone, what is a topic that you just feel really strongly about and that you can convince somebody that, to why they should believe what you believe. And, and then I'd get a volunteer and it wasn't usually politics. I tried to stay away from that, but it's like vegetarianism or,
mhm,
maybe gun control, something like that. And then, I'd say, okay, well, this is a debate. We need somebody who feels very strongly on the other side. And then somebody would volunteer, somebody who ate a lot of meat or whatever. And they
mhm.
would volunteer, bring them up to the front of the class, and then tell them they're switching roles. So,
Oh, wow.
and they're like just kind of dumbfounded at first, but it's amazing. Some Many of the students, I would say most of the students are very good about thinking on their feet and just all of a sudden becoming a vegetarian who now loves meat, and vice versa. And it was fun usually, and they did a great job. I was very impressed. But it's when when you ask somebody to actually do something like that they probably never have had to argue the other side um, before. It's just such a great way to let them form some critical thinking skills
Mhm,
without even knowing it. Um, and I would love to see um, more training like that, more role playing, more rehearsing, maybe before you go out and interview, especially for a long project story. How am I going to, almost like, you know, almost like the presidential candidates rehearse for debates. Maybe we
mhm,
should start doing that in journalism too. But it's a good way to think like someone else for once,
mhm.
to
Well, and
really get to their heads.
And at heart, journalism really seeks to tell people's stories and stories of issues and what's important to a community. And if you can't like faithfully bring those voices out, you're really kind of just developing a one-sided space.
Right, right.
So I think these are all really interesting ways to kind of continue to have journalists really embed deeply in their communities, and then also to share with community members how they can. Nobody wants to feel like they're being manipulated by
Mhm.
outside forces, and that really is the goal of a lot of misinformation.
That's right. Um, there's something called pre-bunking, which is sometimes called inoculation.
Hmm.
So when you're writing a story or shooting a video, doing any kind of program, news program, you start by saying to people, there's a lot of misinformation surrounding this topic. You just go ahead and address it,
Hmm.
um, and tell them what some of the misinformation is and you're going to be hearing about this and this and this. And and this is research backed, by the way. This is tons of research on this. And by the time they read the story, they are looking for clues that they
Mhm.
normally would not, or when they talk to somebody next time about this issue, they're looking for those clues because nobody's ever really explained it like that to them before. And I just love the idea of pre-bunking or inoculation.
That's a
So
great idea.
you have that vaccine against fake news. So
Yes. Well, and thank you so much for sharing some of the tips and markers that journalists can use to combat misinformation in their areas. And I know you're out in the world in your Medium site and a lot of other places, is still working on these issues, and I'm really grateful that you're doing the work. So thank you for being with us today.
sure, sure. And thank you for doing this podcast. It's just a great resource.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for listening to 5 Dubs with Rebecca Snyder. Please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts so that others can find us. What do you want to know about local journalism? Email me at rsnyder, SNYDER, at mddcpress.com. Interested in supporting our podcast and journalism? Please donate to our 501c3 Press Foundation. Find out more and see the full episode list and show notes at www.5-dubs.com.